Today on In the Know, we've been speaking with industry executives about demand planning across a number of verticals. Let's hear what they have to say.
I would characterize the growth of analytics and data, in three dimensions, right? You have volume, velocity, and volatility. And what I mean by that is there's been a tremendous amount of data creation, over the last few years. In fact, it's estimated that about 90% of the data that we currently have has been created over the last 5 years. Then there's that speaks to the amount of data that's actually being generated on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Then we have what we call as volatility of the data, which is the frequency at which we get the data and whether the data is clean, the data is dirty, what are the different components and subcomponents of the data itself, right? And then we have volume, we have volatility, and we have variability as well, which is a big component of what the data is. Now, historically, companies have not had the opportunity to analyze this data, even though they had access to this data, because technology had not yet evolved to help companies generate what I call as actionable insights from the availability of big data. Now everything has changed. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of tools on the analytics side that give companies the ability to analyze two sets of data, what I call as structured data, where you actually have field names, point of sale information, or customer related information that's codified and classified, but the volume is huge. That's what I call as structured data. There's unstructured data, which includes things like weather patterns, traffic. So the ability of analytics to sort of marry both structured and unstructured data together and provide actionable insights to companies is actually transforming demand planning. And how we see that changing the landscape is, you may want to send, if it's going to rain maybe a day or two in advance, you can actually have Walmart ship an entire set of umbrellas to a couple of stores where they expect consumers going to come in and step in and buy umbrellas, right? The same goes for beer or cereal, right? So depending on you gain an understanding of what actually drives category planning and how you basically better place your items, because ultimately from a demand planning perspective, demand planning is all about placing the right product at the right place at the right time in the right quantity, right? So that's the holy grail that companies are chasing. So whatever helps them to help sort of accomplish that in an organized fashion, in a read and react fashion, and capture additional sales, that's incremental value add. So now we have the ability from a data standpoint to analyze this information, present it, and also drive actionable decisions from an allocation standpoint, from a supply chain standpoint, to make sure that you're actually able to have this inventory in the store at the right time. Where I see from a planning and a supply chain standpoint is, even if planning is taking like 2 leaps ahead, supply chain is following right behind, because ultimately if you do generate an insight and say, let's send yellow umbrellas to the store, your supply chain should be able to have the inventory and the transportation mechanism and logistics sort of network to be able to react fast, right? So that you don't want to lose that sale. So those are, I think, some of the trends that I feel from a data standpoint are transforming planning, as we know. They're using it, but not as effectively as they should. And they're using bits and pieces. Remember, I think the power of demand planning, and integrated with your supply chain, can only be harnessed if you can look at it holistically, entirely. So when you're doing bits and pieces, pulling bits and pieces of data from one segment of the supply chain or point of sale, but not marrying it with the larger structured and unstructured analysis, is not going to give you that actionable insights. Some companies are beginning to do that, but they're just at the tip of realizing what the potential of that is going to be. But we still have a long way to go. But my hope is in the next 3 to 5 years, I think we'll get there.
You've, at some time in the past, you wrote a blog in which you said that one can no longer hide behind MAPE. Well, walk us through that. What did you mean by that? Why can't you?
Well, the reason I mention that is that as demand planners, we tend to focus just on what we call MAPE, mean absolute percentage error, to measure our effectiveness, when in fact, the consumers of our forecasts are actually looking at other things that are more business relevant, like revenue, profitability. And we tend to focus just on what we're going to forecast rather than what are the things that influence the forecast. So one of the things I talked about is in order to understand that, you have to invest in more things other than just process and technology. You have to invest in people skills, as well as what we call predictive analytics. Most companies are just using descriptive analytics to do reporting. In order to really understand those things that influence demand, like price, advertising, sales promotions, you have to have a different skill set, you have to have different technology, and you have to be able to do predictive analytics. In other words, measure the impact of all those things and be more business relevant. The reason why a lot of our forecasts aren't used by the people who consume our forecasts, like marketing and sales and senior level management, is because it's not as business relevant to them. They don't really know or even care about MAPE. They care about how much revenue are we going to generate based on the things that influence it, and how's that going to impact the forecast. So we need to be more business relevant and focus on those things, not so much on MAPE. In fact, most executives are willing to give up some points of accuracy or precision in the forecast to have more precision in measuring what influences the forecast. And then also process. Process has to be not vertically integrated, but horizontally integrated. So many of our processes are vertically integrated and are not connected. We can't synchronize demand and supply as a result. So there needs to be a horizontal process that crosses over with horizontal metrics. So we have to share certain metrics, not just MAPE, because sales and marketing, they don't measure anything by MAPE. They measure their performance by revenue, profitability, and how much they can get per each dollar they spend to increase demand. Okay, so we need to find common metrics. They also need to invest in skills in not just descriptive analytics, but also predictive analytics. And finally, they need to upgrade their technology to be more scalable to handle big data and utilize the power of predictive analytics. So there's 4 key areas. There's people, process, analytics, and technology.
The common belief is that input from salespeople is integral and important to the forecasting process, but you seem to challenge that view. Walk us through that. What do you mean by that?
Sure thing, Russell. Well, early in my career, this experience, working for a large consumer products company, we had about 500 finished items shipped and sold through 10 distribution centers. So that made about 5,000 weekly forecasts we were responsible for generating. We had the belief, which is very commonly held, that it'd be a good idea to get our salespeople involved, provide their input to fine-tune these forecasts to make them more accurate. So we went through the effort of persuading the vice president of sales to commit his people to participate in the process. We started tracking the numbers, and after a couple of months of the weekly forecasting performance reports, we realized we weren't getting any better at that DC item level, which is what we cared about for fulfilling demand. This was kind of a rude awakening for me and kind of an embarrassment for those of us who had asked and pleaded for the sales input. And that we came to realize there were really 3 things that need to happen before sales input can be relevant and useful in forecasting. One is that salespeople can actually forecast their customers' demand at the item level. Second is that salespeople, even if they can forecast accurately, will they give you an honest answer in the process? And the third is, even if you are getting better forecasts at a customer item level, does that make the forecast that matters, the DC item level, very much more accurate? So those were the learnings from this early kind of a rough foray into incorporating Salesforce input.
Let's walk through the ways that companies utilize to get input from that sales team, in the forecasting process. Walk us through that.
Really 2 common ways. One is just throw out a blank spreadsheet to the salespeople and say, fill it in. What are your customers going to be ordering of these items over the next weeks, months, whatever kind of time period you're dealing with? The other, which seems to be strongly preferred in the literature and I think in practice, is that you first, from a corporate forecasting standpoint, send out your initial forecast. They can be a statistical forecast or however generated. Send to the salespeople, this is what we think your numbers are for these customers, for these items. Pencil in a change if you feel the number's different. So at least give them something to start. One of the key points to remember here is the salespeople, they're not hired because they're forecasters. They're hired because they're salespeople. And so it takes a little bit of the effort off them to try to create numbers out of the blue.
Well, we're talking about the future of supply chain. We're talking about demand driven. So we're going to be becoming more demand oriented towards our supply chain. And things are starting to change. The consumer is wanting more. We're wanting more faster. Big data is getting bigger. So all those things are requiring different skill sets. Problem is, we got a perfect storm that may be brewing. With massive amount of baby boomers going out of the workforce. I've heard anywhere from 60 million to 80 million that's going to be leaving the workforce in the next 10 years. That's not going to be replaced. We're only got about 40 million coming back into the workforce right now. And those are coming in with not the skill sets that's necessary for what's going to be changing in the supply chain. So we need to be able to keep up with this. Academia is not keeping up with it. Companies aren't keeping up with this. That's the problem we're going to be facing in the future. We're going to outstrip this current supply of people. Some surveys put it as high as about 10 to 1 in the next 10 years as far as the need versus the supply. It's going to be the big problem facing demand planners.
Well, as you know, there's many different players in a forecasting process or a process cycle, and FVA is kind of the tool that will allow you to assess how well each of those different contributions to your forecast, what kind of a contribution they're having to the success of your forecast. I know in past lives as a forecaster, there's a lot of pressure to get that forecast right. But there's a whole lot of people that have input into what that final forecast should be. So using FVA helps you determine who's having the biggest impact within your supply chain or within your contribution to your forecast, and allows you to really go after those portions of the forecast that you can positively impact. For example, if you have a particular contribution from maybe executives, maybe your sales force that is actually devaluing your forecast, you can start to have some of those critical conversations about what needs to be done to improve that part of your process. It's also a little bit empowering for the demand planner. They're the ones who take the brunt of the beating when the forecast is bad. But with FVA, you're able to accurately pinpoint who contributed to the devaluation of your forecast. You know, I think everyone needs to have a seat at the table and make sure that they're heard in the forecasting process. I mean, you can get good intelligence from sales. Sometimes even executives have good things to add or input into the forecast. However, I think we need to be very wary of what everyone's role is in that process. For example, a sales guy is always going to tell you that he's going to bring in tons of sales. That might not be the reality that we're facing in the current market. So being able to segment that information and accurately measure what everyone's bringing to the table can only help your process. We know forecasting is a very political activity, but actually bringing to light how we're valuing or devaluing the forecast with each of those steps helps you have the right conversation. Often the conversation boils down to, for forecasting, well, you just need better software, or we need more information or more analytics, or maybe we need more people at the table. And sometimes that's not the case.
Well, there you have it. Information you can use, information that puts you in the know.